As Rachel said, I'm going to speak about coexistence and co-location. So my research is largely based around ambiguity in policy language. So today's talk is going to be on that and a bit of a deep dive into one of my case studies. So I'll probably start with the research background just to bring everyone up to speed of what it is I'm actually looking into, and then looking into sort of universal challenges towards understanding coexistence and co-location and how I'm going about doing this using boundary object theory, the approach I'm taking, and my case study on the Orkney Islands marine region, and then just a little bit about where I'm going next. So this project is the COCOMAR project that funds my PhD. So it's enabling coexistence and co-location in shared island marine governance. This is a joint project between University College Cork, Queen's University Belfast, with some input from the Marine Institute Fisheries, Ecosystems and Advisory Services. So there's 3 PhDs under this project, and mine comes into the second theme of cross-compliance of policies for sectoral activities, which is managed under marine spatial planning. So my research question really aims at what the role of marine planning is in resolving spatial demands around the island of Ireland. So taking into consideration the transboundary aspect and how that adds a little bit of complexity to the governance arrangements here. So at the moment, these are sort of ever evolving, but I took to doing a literature review and found that there's an awful lot of confusion on what the coexistence and co-location terms actually mean and how they can be operationalized. So this led me to do a policy review to examine how these are framed, what they mean, and how they're understood. So I'm taking this to stakeholders or participants really to see if we can find a general understanding. So when I went to look at the literature, a lot of different terms came up that were sort of in the place of coexistence and co-location, often used interchangeably. So multi-use, coordination, compatibility, shared use, these types of things. So this is a word cloud that I use just from my literature review alone, so not even looking into the policy side of things. But it just shows how there's such a variation of things that can be used or are being used. So when I was looking into policy documents and academic papers, I came across a lot of different definitions. So I've just taken a sample here to show that in Scotland, in marine planning, coexistence is where multiple developments, activities, or uses can exist alongside or close to each other in the same place and or at the same time. And an academic definition, coexistence in the context of marine governance typically refers to the principle that various uses of marine resources should be managed in a way that allows them to occur simultaneously without disseminating impacts resulting in significant conflict. There was a lot more, and my thesis will sum them all up and try and get to a sort of universal understanding. And I've done the same here for co-location, looking into what these actually mean. So co-location is a subset of coexistence and is where multiple developments, activities, or uses coexist in the same place by sharing the same footprint or area or infrastructure. And this is also how it's perceived in Scotland. So another academic definition is multiple fixed activities operating in the same place at the same time that maximizes resource or spatial efficiency. So similarities between the languages of coexistence and co-location, I've sort of alluded to, there's a bit of a passive and an active approach here, whereas coexistence can somehow can seemingly be passive and sort of happening organically as well as planned, whereas co-location, there's a definite approach, an idea of what should be temporarily or spatially allocated in a certain part of the sea. So as I mentioned, just looking into how I'm using boundary object theory. So one of the definitions of boundary objects are that they're plastic enough to adapt to local needs and constraints yet robust enough to maintain a common identity. So throughout all of this deep dive into the literature and the definitions within policy, I originally saw this as an issue, and now I'm wondering whether it is an issue or not. Is it a problem? Can work go on as usual, even if we don't have an exact agreement universally of what these concepts mean? So I'm using boundary object theory as a framework to analyze these concepts with a focus on coexistence and co-location as the boundary objects themselves. So I'm sort of analyzing them and also speaking with different users of the sea to see what they think. And that is how I'm going to approach this research. So just to reiterate, that's a policy analysis that is informing semi-structured interviews. And at the end, I will do a backcasting workshop to sort of validate these results that come out of this. So at the moment, I'm wrapping up the policy analysis, and I have completed the first out of 3 comparative case studies. The first one is in Orkney, and the second one is the island of Ireland. So taking into consideration the transboundary aspect, and I'll hopefully go on to the Netherlands in the springtime after that. But just to take a little bit of a deep dive into Orkney, it's such an interesting archipelago to explore, and I'm quite lucky to call it home now as well. So the themes that I've explored through semi-structured interviews are policy and regulation, definitions and understanding, principles of coexistence and co-location, processes and practice, sector interactions, barriers and enablers, and future and innovation. So I'm going to go through these now individually as time allows. So the first one, I've posed this question: is policy the problem or is delivery the problem? And a quote that I've picked out from the initial analysis from my interviews is: local regulators don't take the time to sit down and see that they have an amazing the opportunity to do something amazing internationally. Maybe they don't have the resources or the time. I'll just reiterate that this are quotes and not my own opinions, but it's interesting to see here that there's frustration between time and resources, but it is very much recognized that there's an opportunity to do something. So what does it show? It shows that there is intent, but that there is capacity constraints. And I quite liked this quote: I'm not a great believer in the way policy framework that just says no. It should be a policy that ensures that you think about things the right way. So there's lots of interpretations of what the right way might be. But I guess, why does this matter? So we can't really rely on goodwill alone. We have it requires resourced governance. In terms of definitions and understanding, I asked participants how they would define coexistence and co-location, and then I followed up with whether they should be used interchangeably. So when I spoke to a marine spatial planning specialist, they looked to the Scottish definition and added that they say co-location is a subset of coexistence, but it also needs early partnership communication between developers. I should note that it's many people be aware that there is a little bit of appetite for clarity on what these actually mean. So I believe fisheries and aquaculture have sought clarity in the definitions in terms of fixed base, and then I think the renewable sector, we're looking to see a little bit more flexibility. So it'll be interesting to see what could they conclude with, and those definitions will be quite beneficial for the policy users. So what does this show? Misunderstandings are often unintentional, and language shapes expectations and risk perception. So I spoke with an offshore renewable energy specialist who assumed that coexistence and co-location meant the same things, but were just used differently. So why does this matter? Differences in understanding are implicit rather than openly contested. So the principles of coexistence and co-location. Is co-location being treated as a subset of coexistence? When I did further ask about whether the co-location and coexistence can be used interchangeably, it sort of showed an agreement at principle level of what these things mean, but when we try to operationalize them, there was a bit of a divergence in what they actually mean. So speaking with another ORE specialist, they mentioned that there was an economic argument. So whether something is one way or another usually comes down to what kind of relative economic benefits we'll see. So why does this matter? Without shared principle, co-location becomes a spatial fix and not a collaborative process. So in terms of processes and practice, it's a little bit of a follow-on from policy and regulation. So do good processes compensate for weak coordination? I spoke with an ORE specialist who worked extensively on another continent, and they were really praising the systems that are in the UK at the moment. So I think the one-stop shop, that mechanism, is glorious compared to other jurisdictions, which I believe took over 12 years to get consent for a wave energy device to be deployed. So I think it's all relative, but it is interesting to compare with other jurisdictions and see where we can learn. So when I spoke to marine spatial planning specialist, they spoke about a bit of a disconnect. So by the time the policy is implemented, technology has moved on. Legislation is maybe not keeping up to date with how things are. So they really stress this iterative process that we should try and enable. So process efficiency does not always equal coexistent outcomes. So in terms of sector interactions, which is what I'm really interested in terms of this multi-use coexistence, co-location kind of things, I asked people what they thought about aquaculture and offshore renewable energy mostly. We did speak of other sectors as well, but realistically, when I spoke to an ORE innovation specialist, they said they didn't see much appetite for offshore renewable energy alongside. This was in relation to aquaculture, but yeah, I don't see much appetite from the offshore renewable energy side to really engage in co-location until benefits are demonstrated. So this sort of, when I was summing up all the different answers to this question from the different people I spoke with, there's variable appetite for engagement. So it sort of begged the question, just because we can, should we? Is there really, like, who is this benefiting? And this really was in relation to aquaculture and offshore renewable energy. We touched on carbon capture and storage as well, but I'm not specialized in that area, and I'm not looking into it either. But it was an interesting development in the conversation. So it really shows that risk isn't evenly distributed, and that there really needs to be an incentive rather than just a concept. So this engagement reflected incentives and exposure to risk as to whether we should or not co-locate for different activities. So what are the barriers and enablers? How do policy mechanisms function in practice? Usually this question went either one or two ways. It was usually whether someone started with the barriers, they would either list or speak about a couple, and then it would just be the case that the enablers were the opposite to what the barriers were, or vice versa. So, but to summarize, what I found is that the limited clarity around the policy process was really a missed opportunity. So lack of engagement and clarity in policy often turns what could be enablers into barriers. So this was speaking with an aquaculture specialist. And lack of information and data. And there was many reasons for this. I think that trust came up an awful lot depending on who I was speaking with. But why it matters is the effectiveness of a policy is highly dependent on how policies are and sort of, well, I guess just mechanisms are operationalized. So I guess the need for adaptive governance to respond to these different elements and to kind of keep this iterative process and keeping stakeholders involved at all stages was really showing through this theme. So I kind of tied up my semi-structured interviews with how people saw marine planning, I guess, evolving over the next 10 to 15 years. And a lot of people kind of came back with that. They were hoping things would become more spatial. And this has kind of shown throughout different consultation responses that there was a bit of a lack of a spatial element to a few different marine plans. So now, with the way it's going, it was more of a positive outlook. And funnily enough, out of 25, only one person mentions the importance of the land-sea interaction and how that the terrestrial planning documents should not necessarily reflect, but sort of respond, I guess, to marine planning as well. So at the moment, I have concluded with the initial findings that sectoral interpretations matter. So boundary objects theory has really helped me conceptualize how these different interpretations don't always necessarily bring a bad thing. So, and for one sector, it might be an issue, but for another, it might actually be a benefit. So they can't always be operationalized, and maybe they should not. And the rhetoric in the policy documents shows that there is a really big gap between putting policy into practice and operationalizing these concepts. Collaboration requires incentives, and the lessons learned in the Orkney case study show how we can sort of better manage all of these things here on the island of Ireland. But as I said, these are just the initial findings, so I'm going to be doing a full analysis, and also then once I've done the comparative case studies, I'll be able to do an even more in-depth analysis of the 3 different regions, which will be quite exciting and hopefully drop a few more understandings. But I have wrapped up my Orkney case study, but I still have time, I think, if there was anyone else who has an interest in participating, but especially for the island of Ireland and the Netherlands, if there's anybody here who would be interested, or if anybody has any feedback or extra questions that we don't have time for today, it would be great to hear from you. So thanks for your time.
Many thanks, Rebecca. That was really interesting to hear. And just to say, there'll be opportunity to ask questions at the end. The next speaker that we are welcoming today is Kerstin Joyce, who's joining us from Nordregio in Sweden. Nordregio is a independent research centre, which I'm sure Kerstin will be telling you about. And Kerstin is a senior research advisor there. But research primarily focuses in marine spatial planning projects, both in the Nordic and the EU, as well as other projects on sustainability more broadly. And I'll pass it over to Kerstin.
Thank you so much, Rachel. Happy to be here. Thank you very much. And as Rachel mentioned, Nordregio is an independent Nordic and also international research institute established by the Nordic Council of Ministers, but mainly project funded. So, but a lot of our projects are for the Nordic Council of Ministers, including this one that I will present shortly.
Kerstin, we can't see slides at the minute.
You cannot see slides at the moment. Okay, then we'll try again. So far, you can only see where we live. I hope you can see it now, correct?
All good.
And a majority of what Nordregio does is policy-related research. Here are some of our core research areas, for example, governance and urban rural planning and development, and also regional development. And you can scan our project portfolio there if you wish. You can find out more on our website. This project I will present now, Green Energy Meets Blue Food, Sustainable Coexistence in Nordic Seas, goes under the name Green Meets Blue. Has been a 2-year project, started early 2024 and ends now in March this year. It's been funded by the Nordic Council of Ministers for Fisheries and Aquaculture, and it relates to one of the most pressing challenges facing also Nordic marine spatial planners. How can Nordic countries enable space both for expanding offshore wind energy and other offshore energy in their marine areas, and at the same time enable marine food production? And I work as a senior research advisor at Nordregio and have a background as environmental economist, and also worked a lot in water and marine policy. I just want to give you a quick context as this is a Nordic project. Just to mention that the challenges facing Nordic countries are not so different from other countries. Nordic countries have set up ambitious climate and energy targets, and offshore renewable energy, and not least offshore wind, will in general play an important role in reaching these targets. And at the same time, several countries in the Nordic region have very strong marine sectors. And in some countries, fisheries is economically, but also culturally vital. But governance systems are in some respects designed for more stable conditions, perhaps, and often sectorial and marine spatial planning is one key framework in this picture when planning activities at sea. So our project is taking a marine spatial planning lens, one could say. Some of the Nordic countries are also EU members who need to comply with the EU Maritime Spatial Planning Directive, although some Nordic countries who are not EU members have other approaches. The overall aim with our project, Green Meets Blue, has been to enhance the knowledge on how to enable coexistence that can last long term, and in a Nordic context, of course. And our project focuses on how to enable coexistence primarily between offshore wind and fishery. So primarily, not least commercial fishery. So we focus a lot on trade-offs, conflicts and synergies, and what this means for coexistence. And this is a research project, and then you have research questions, of course, but I have phrased them here as more of an overview of what we have done in our project. We have looked through marine spatial planning lens, as I mentioned, and we have also digged into literature and reviewed how coexistence has been described in research more broadly. And here I can just note that when looking at conflicts and trade-offs, conflicts and synergies, the most common conflicts in literature is over space and between offshore wind energy and commercial fishery. And when it comes to synergies, you can find less in literature, but when it appears, it's primarily between offshore wind and aquaculture. We have then also analyzed how this are addressed, focusing on Nordic marine spatial planning documents and similar policy documents. And we've also conducted case studies to see how this plays out in different geographical contexts and settings across the Nordic region. And of course, try to see what lessons we can draw from Nordic experiences in policy and planning. So based on a quite extensive literature research, and also when we started engaging with stakeholders in the different Nordic countries, including also our reference group, where both marine spatial planners and researchers and policymakers have taken part, we realized that in our case studies, we need to focus on what drives and what hinders actors to coexist. We performed case studies in the autumn of 2024 in Finland, the west coast of Sweden, west coast of Denmark, more generally in Norway, and also in Iceland, which is a bit the special case because they don't have offshore wind, but on coexistence between renewable energy and primarily marine protection, that case. We also have a case study in Scotland, and I think part of this you will hear more of when Kirsty speaks after me, I hope. So in these case studies, we interviewed offshore renewable energy actors, such as developers, wind developers, fishery actors, both large and small fishery organizations, local, regional, national authorities, etc., focusing to better understand drivers and hindrances for the offshore wind actors and fishery actors to coexist. And you can find all our 6 case studies as an interactive digital story map. If you click on this link, you come to the interactive map, and you can either just read a specific case study or you can read the whole publication, and it's very interactive. We published this last year, and we also, for example, had a Nordic workshop on coexistence for offshore wind and blue food in May last year, where we focused on collaboration challenges and opportunities for offshore wind developers and also fishery, and we had some aquaculture actors as well along the whole development process of offshore wind. And we had participants from several Nordic countries, but also from Scotland, and we had Rachel presenting the Scottish case study, for example. We also had researchers from the Netherlands, and both from actors from the planning side, offshore wind business side, researchers, etc. So when mapping out these challenges and opportunities across these phases, one thing that is very clear is that collaboration is key, and the collaboration, even though collaboration needs vary by phase, what actors need are continuity and early engagement across all these phases. I can just mention, this is the slide I'm showing now. I borrowed from offshore Norway and from our Norwegian case study, but it was also presented during this workshop. And this example shows also how the concept of coexistence is viewed differently in different countries. This case has been referred to somewhat of a perhaps success story when it comes to coexistence, and also inspired other countries. And it's actually about collaboration between offshore wind actors and fishery actors specifically. So from experiences with the oil and gas industry in Norway, the Offshore Norway, who is an organization representing diverse ocean industries, took the incentive to establish a working group with offshore wind energy industry and fishery organizations. And within this working group, they jointly developed this Drejeboka, as they call it, which is a kind of a guidance document, and also developed principles of what coexistence implies, and how the different actors should interact with each other. And here is just to show an example how they develop principles and guidance at each step of the offshore wind process. So the idea is that all offshore wind companies will adhere to the principles and the Drejeboka if they're given license to develop wind farms in Norway. So you can say that it's kind of a license to operate. And moving on to one of our latest publications, we published a policy brief from our project in October, November last year. And This policy brief synthesizes many of our findings and based to a large degree on our case studies and workshop, etc. But one of our core messages in this policy brief is that tension arises not only from spatial competition, but from contrasting values, different operational practices, and ultimately different relationships with the marine environment from different actors. And all this sort of complex interaction plays out within highly fragmented and inconsistent political and planning and also permitting systems. So the implication is that for coexistence to be long-lasting, this requires structures for continuous and meaningful collaboration, not just only technical spatial solutions. And also in our policy brief, we have, based on our analysis, we have highlighted 3 interconnected challenges to governance that we reinforce each other. And the first one we call political volatility, which is really about unstable political landscapes in countries. What we've seen when we've, both from interviews and also in literature research, that when governments suddenly sort of shift priorities, for example, in Denmark and also in Sweden for offshore wind developers, subsidies have quickly been changed, which highly affects their willingness to invest, or when regulations change quickly for both actors, it erodes trust and undermines sectors' ability to plan, but also to collaborate with each other, between sectors. The second one is about marine spatial planning frameworks that has limitations vis-a-vis stakeholders primarily. That it's we understood from interviews that it's often unclear what marine spatial planning can actually deliver for different actors. In some countries, the plans are legally binding, such as in Denmark, whereas in others they're only advisory. And stakeholder engagement is to some degree inconsistent and not always continues over time, and that impact assessments, and not least the assessment of cumulative impacts, needs to be developed further. And so across all our case studies, it was brought up that unclear planning mandates make it difficult for actors to have confidence in spatial coexistence, if you could say that. For example, in Denmark, several fishery actors were advocating there's no coexistence at all. And what they talk about is really that there's not much collaboration or interaction. The third challenge is within permitting system that is often not aligned with marine spatial planning processes and also fragmented in themselves. They're often, in contrast to marine spatial plans that are assessed at a basin scale, permits are analyzed and given based on specific projects. And this all also reduces transparency. And it's not very easy to understand as a stakeholder which process you are involved in all the time, whether this is part of the marine spatial planning stakeholder engagement process or if this is a permit process. So this also affects actors' trust and engagement. But in our policy brief, we also point to some ideas for governance to better enable coexistence. And these are drawn from these examples across the Nordic region that we have looked into. One country doesn't have all the solutions, but one country has part of the solution. and we think that there's a lot to build on. This first one about establishing a structured dialogue is very much based on the way the actors and the broker of offshore Norway has worked with developing this collaboration guidance with sustained forums and with skill facilitation and building up trust and trying to understand each sector's issues and actually how the sector works. The second one is about fostering a more participatory culture, and this is very much based on work in Finland's marine spatial planning process, where a lot is invested in stakeholder engagement and inclusive and bottom-up processes with feedback loops and strengthening trust among actors. And the third one here is really about the importance of strengthening knowledge foundations. What we can see is, for example, in many cases for permits, developers are responsible for impact assessments only looking at environmental and often only negative environmental impacts from a specific already approved project. What is needed is more early, broad and inclusive also impact assessment that integrate ecological and socioeconomic data more across scales and before site selection is made. The third one here is more about creating institutional pathways, and this is to some degree related to the way the one-stop shop process they have in Denmark with more centralized permitting and strategic phased offshore wind energy governance models. So where public authority leads early planning and also take quite a lot of the risk of and costs for analysis prior to handing over to developers. As this is a Nordic project, our recommendation is also Nordic, but I think it could be interesting still to know. In Nordic countries, we have a lot to build upon: shared sea basins and ecosystems and strong democratic traditions, robust stakeholder engagement often. So we can see that the cross-border dialogue is needed and also wanted from Nordic marine spatial planners. There was the very first Nordic Marine Spatial Planning Forum in Finland during the Finnish chairmanship of the Nordic Council of Ministers last autumn, where we also presented this project, and it's clear that there is an interest for a Nordic dialogue. So our recommendation is not to create a new platform, but to build on existing platforms to create a Nordic level dialogue platform. Such a platform could navigate sectoral tensions and exchange lessons and develop shared tools. There's a Swedish tool on how to better assess cumulative impacts that's called Symphony, for example, that has now also inspired Denmark, I believe, to develop something similar. And the focus of this dialogue would be then these 4 building blocks that I went through, and we also have some guiding questions in the policy brief that could kickstart such a dialogue. And then I just wanted to mention that we also have a longer project report that explains a bit more extensively how we went about in the project, method-wise, etc., and it includes a lot of literature and good references. And if you want to find out more, just please get in touch with us, and you can also find all our publications on our project website. And I believe I will stop there. And thank you so much for having me this webinar today.
Thank you, Kerstin. That's really interesting. We'll now be moving over to a pre-recorded presentation by Kirsty Wright from the Marine Directorate of the Scottish Government. Kirsty is a senior marine fish and fisheries scientist in the Renewable Energy and Ecology team. Sadly, she wasn't able to join us today, so her her presentation is pre-recorded, but her colleague, as I mentioned before, Emily Simmons, will be joining to take questions at the end on the behalf of the Marine Directorate. Hopefully press play.
Hi everyone, my name is Kirsty Wright. I'm a senior marine fish and fisheries scientist. I work at the Marine Directorate of the Scottish Government. Apologies I can't be here in person today. However, my colleague Emily will be available in the question session afterwards to help with any questions, and I can also answer any questions you might have via email afterwards. So today I'm going to talk to you about the good practice guidance that we have. So this is a good practice guidance on assessing fisheries displacement by other licensed marine activities. So first of all, I thought we could just start with a little introduction on fishing and offshore wind farms in Scotland. And first of all, there are no legal restrictions to fishing within offshore wind farms in Scottish waters. This differs to the law in some EU countries, for example, Germany, where fishing in offshore wind farms is legally prohibited. However, despite there being no legal restrictions to fishing in wind farms in Scotland, fishers have raised concerns over safety, insurance cover and liability for any damage to the wind farm assets or their vessel, and these concerns may prevent them from entering or fishing within wind farms. So I also wanted to go into a wee bit more detail about floating offshore wind farms in the context of commercial fisheries. So floating offshore wind farms present a greater conflict with commercial fishing compared to bottom fixed offshore wind farms, and that's largely due to the subsea infrastructure that you can see on the photo, and that's things like mooring chains, anchor lines, and dynamic cables, which are all free hanging in the water column. So floating offshore wind farms may create exclusion zones for some types of fishing, for example, mobile fishing, such as your trawling and dredging with nets, due to safety risks, such as gear snagging. I also wanted to set the scene for the good practice guidance by defining what we're meaning by fisheries displacement. So this is a definition that is in the guidance. So the displacement of fishing activity refers to the relocation of fishing activity from an area into other areas as a result of the presence of other licensed marine activities and or associated infrastructure. And some of the potential impacts associated with fisheries displacement, these are the main ones that we also tend to see in EIAs, environmental impact assessments. So that can be things like temporary or permanent exclusion from fishing grounds or loss of access, increased competition for fishing grounds and conflict between or within fishing methods, pressure on fish resource, potential decreases or changes in catch of certain target species, lack of available quota or vessel gear changes that might be needed, increased steaming time to access alternative fishing grounds, and also social economic impacts. So I wanted to go into the rationale and some of the drivers for the good practice guidance. So first of all, starting with the overarching policy driver, being Scotland's National Marine Plan and its Gen 4 coexistence policy, which highlights the importance of coexistence between offshore wind farms and commercial fisheries. And then secondly, we've got the Scottish Marine Energy Research Programme, which is SCOTMER for short. And it's basically a research programme that's designed to identify and address evidence gaps that are associated with offshore renewables and different receptors. So there are 7 different receptor groups in SCOTMER. For example, there's marine mammals and ornithology, but the one relevant for this talk is the fish and fisheries receptor group. So part of the role of the receptor group is to identify evidence gaps that are associated with marine fish, commercial fisheries, and offshore renewables, which is at the moment mainly offshore wind. And these evidence gaps are all detailed in a very large and a bit complex spreadsheet, which you can find online if you're interested. So I've picked out these 4 main evidence gaps as being the ones that are most relevant. So these are methods to predict fisheries displacement levels and locations for future offshore developments, monitoring of commercial fishing activity in the vicinity of offshore wind farms and cables, improving how commercial fisheries impacts are assessed in environmental impact assessments and cumulative impact assessments, and lastly, coexistence between offshore renewables and commercial fishing. So these are some of the main drivers behind the guidance. There was also identified a lack of standardised methodology for fisheries displacement assessments in EIAs, and some concerns were also raised by commercial fisheries stakeholders. So the Good Practice Guidance project was commissioned by the Marine Directorate, and it was contracted to Exodus to undertake this work. The work mainly focused on offshore wind, but other licensed marine activities were included as well, such as marine renewables, oil and gas, aquaculture, and MDAs, just so that this guidance was also relevant and could be used for other purposes as well. So these are the links on our Scottish Government ScotMIR website for the Good Practice Guidance, if anyone's interested in having a look after the talk. And I just basically put these 2 up here just to make it clear that the Good Practice Guidance was split into 2 different documents. So we've got our literature review, which I'll go into next, and then also a separate link to the actual Good Practice Guidance document itself, which condenses some of the literature review and then details the Good Practice Guidance. So just wanted to point that out. So the literature review, to start off with, basically aimed to collate and analyse existing guidance, data, studies, and stakeholder feedback that was relevant to the potential impact of commercial fishery displacement. It also identified the kind of key knowledge gaps and suggested recommendations for the guidance. And basically the conclusion for the literature review that whilst there were some different approaches identified for assessing displacement already, it was clear that we really needed a standardised approach for assessing displacement. So the project included lots of stakeholder engagement, which basically started right from the start on deciding the project scope, all the way through the project, all the way to kind of publication of the guidance. Which I think is really key, just to make sure that lots of different stakeholders can input their kind of comments and feedback, and that can kind of get built into the guidance itself, and ensure that everyone's happy with the output at the end. So the consultation was largely undertaken with the Fish and Fisheries ScotMIR Receptor Group, and this group consists of representatives from environmental NGOs, the fishing industry, offshore wind farm developers, and academia. And Exodus, the consultant, undertook 1-hour consultation workshops with the group, and then also made sure to follow up with anyone who missed those workshops or if they needed any extra information. And they provided kind of key questions to the consultees just to help kind of focus their feedback and ensure that they could get good input in the meetings. And yes, as I said from the start, stakeholders fed into kind of all aspects of the project, so that fed into the literature review, which was really great to capture anything that might not be found on the web, and also the guidance document itself. So really shaping that document was really key. So the 3 main aims for the Good Practice Guidance were to provide a clear definition for commercial fisheries displacement, and that was the one that I read to you at the start. Also to provide standardised guidance for the sourcing, analysis and presentation of commercial fisheries data for the production of environmental baselines. And lastly, to provide guidance and key points for consideration for developers, EIA, practitioners and stakeholders relevant to the assessment of commercial fisheries displacement. So the guidance mainly focused on fishing methods identified as priority research areas for displacement So these were the Scottish king scallop dredge fishery, the demersal trawl fishery, including pair trawling and nephrops trawling, Scottish seine net fleet, and the static fishing gear. So that's your creels and pots. So just to start off with a kind of high level look at what's actually in the good practice guidance, these are some of the kind of key chapter headings. So some of the things in there are a step-by-step guidance on how to carry out a fisheries displacement assessment and what to consider each step. Also a big part of the guidance, and also really useful, is a recommended fisheries data list for use in EIAs, including data limitations and accessibility. Also a chapter on how to analyse and present fisheries data that's useful for EIAs and assessments. How to identify potential impacts. Also how to engage effectively with fishers and fisheries stakeholders, which is really important. And then some other things such as assigning commercial fisheries receptor sensitivity to displacement, also understanding the magnitude of effect for displacement, and how to work out assessment criteria and how to determine the significance of impacts. And then lastly, a chapter on cumulative and in combination assessments for commercial fisheries. So one of the big issues that I think the good practice guidance has really helped with, and that's fisheries data issues. And this is mainly from, I guess, myself and Emily's perspective, being the ones who review EIAs for offshore wind farm developments. And basically some of the main issues that we were seeing were different fisheries data sets were being used by different in different EIAs, and these weren't standardized across different assessments, which made it really challenging. There was also some old out-of-date data that were being used. Data used didn't represent an appropriate timescale to observe the different patterns and trends in fishing activity over time, or didn't reflect the dynamic nature of fishing. And this is especially important for nomadic or non-cyclic fisheries, where they might not fish every single year or every different season. So the risk is that they are missed out of assessments or misrepresented. We were also seeing fisheries data being analysed and presented in lots of different ways, which made it difficult to compare between assessments, and also kind of just created misleading information if graphs weren't showing data properly. And then also just big some data gaps as well, specifically for gaps in the inshore fishing data. So these issues were picked up by us in the scientific review of assessments, but the guidance has really now provided this standardised list of recommended fisheries data sets, and it includes obviously how to access and request the data, so that's kind of less questions for us. And as I said before, it includes a chapter how to kind of analyse and present the data properly, and also helps developers to understand the different data limitations and the gaps associated with the data. So yeah, I think it really helps to save time and resource for everyone's part and role in this process, and it really gives a kind of more clear expectations for anyone wishing to undertake a fisheries displacement assessment. So I also just wanted to highlight a really key chapter, also one that I think is really useful for developers to consider, and that's how to assign commercial fisheries receptor sensitivity to displacement. So basically how sensitive is a particular fishery to displacement, and some of the considerations that you have to take into account when thinking about sensitivity. So that can be things like, is there other alternative grounds available for that specific fishery? Do they have knowledge of those alternative grounds? Also having to think about, the minimum spatial operational range for the vessel and the fishing method. So that's things like, what is the minimum spatial requirements for deploying and hauling in their gear? And also, what is the maneuverability of the vessel like when it's fishing? Can it maneuver easily, or is it more difficult because it's got lots of nets down? Also having to think about the skipper and the crew, operating practices, their level of experience, and their perception of risk, which will differ obviously between different individuals and fisheries. Also, are they able to adapt their fishing method, or do they have the ability to switch gear if they're displaced to another area, which might have a different seabed type or target species? The distance from the home port to these alternative grounds, or what's the operational range of the fleet? Is it possible for that fishery to travel further, or to, it might be the alternative grounds are just a bit beyond the actual range that they would normally go. Also having to think about the competition for space and alternative grounds. Is there already lots of fishing happening there already? And what might the impact for that be? Also, importantly, fishing rights and quotas, whether they might need new quotas arranged as well, and the cost of that. The availability and distribution of target species. So some fishing will be able to move around a wee bit more because the target species has a wide distribution, but others might be stuck to specific seabed habitat types. For example, muddy grounds for nephrops. And yeah, I guess the same point, seabed type habitat suitable for target species. So again, that might not be suitable for the species that they're targeting. And then also what kind of infrastructure and activities are in this new area? Are there any, spatial management measures that have to be taken into account, or fisheries restrictions? So this table that I've just shown on the right hand side, this is one of the tables taken out of the guidance, and it's basically a table that Exodus have put together for each of the different fishing methods, which is really handy. So this one, for example, is for nephrops trawling, and it's basically just a table where they have kind of gathered all this information about nephrops trawling. So they've added in, for example, what's the operational area needed when the gear's in use for this particular fishery? What's the kind of typical towing speeds or duration of the tows as well? What's the seasonality for nephrops fishing? What's the manoeuvrability of the vessel? So that's low and medium for nephrops trawling. Availability of other grounds. So this is specific, obviously, to the nephrops grounds, which is typically located in sandy and muddy sediments. And also, again, may depend on quota availability. And also the adaptability of the fishing methods. So for nephrops trawling, they've put can switch to other kinds of trawled gears to target other species, e.g. to rock copper trawl nets with different mesh sizes during the squid season. But this might not be possible for every fisher doing the nephrops trawling. So yeah, lots of really helpful considerations there when how to assign a sensitivity of a fishery to displacement. So lastly, I just wanted to finish up on some of the improvements that the Good Practice Guidance has brought, and also to share some feedback from the fishers. So we've heard from the fishers that the guidance has improved the EIA process and fisheries displacement assessments methodologies by making it clearer and more transparent, and it's also helped to facilitate better decision making. We also heard from fishers that the guidance has provided a better representation of the different fishing fleet segments and really helped to ensure that all fisheries are taken into account in fisheries displacement assessments. So yeah, we're really happy with this feedback, and we hope that the Good Practice Guidance continues to improve fisheries displacement assessments. Thank you very much.